This is Dave Monk, wanting to introduce you to a small prairie on an old interurban. So it's gravelly, and it's taken 70 years for these plants to grow on that space. This is Golden Alexander. You can see that there has been a balance between grasses and the broadleaves that are underneath. The grasses won't come till late June and July. The broadleaves are starting to grow now early in the spring, like May. The white is a daisy Fleabane, which indicates that there's been some disturbance by a meadow vole or a mouse or something like that. So there's a little bit of disturbance. The grasses are left over from the last season, and they're important to be there because these plants have got used to lightning strikes and they burn. So most of the plants that are here are used to being burned. And if we do them in places where you can see the litter that is accumulated from the last year, that needs to be burned. If you the little tiny little white flowers are starry-eyed grass, and we take out the trees that want to grow. Champaign County had about 94% prairie, very few trees, but when you drain for agriculture, for railroad lines, is in the background, then the trees grow and they take over. And you see here starry-eyed grass growing, and it probably would be struggling if it was under a tree. It needs full light. They're only about 6 inches high, very difficult to collect the seed from them. And again, they're looking at the litter, and you have to imagine that all these plants sort of interact with each other. There are associations, and we don't know very much about that, but this is a library of information in there. There's again the litter from last year, which should be burned if there's enough of it. But if you don't have enough grasses, then you won't have enough fuel matrix. There's a little blue stem. You can see it's starting to green up. Normally, if it was burned, the leaves would have more opportunity to grow out to the sunlight. So it allows heat and light to get into the plant earlier if you burn it. Golden Alexander belongs to the carrot family. It comes early in the spring and gives it a nice yellow ambiance. Dock plants are small. You're on a gravel, what used to be an interurban railroad line, so these plants are not going to be as big as you would get on a Drummer and Flanagan soil, which is deep. This is a drainage ditch, and you can see the Golden Alexander growing along the side, the dock. There's a little bit more moisture here, and some soft soil, not gravel, which was the ballast. This is the side of the ballast. So on the right is the Illinois Central corridor, and the left is an old Kankakee interurban. That's you right in on top of a dock with Golden Alexander by it. You don't know how much the fungus underneath the plants is connecting one plant with another, or even in different species in some cases, different associations. So Prairie is rather rich, and we're rather proud of this site because it has a welter of different species. This is a prairie rose. Hasn't bloomed yet, but it's typical of a rose. Some of the roses are standard. Some of them have long underground runners. 2 or 3 different species there. starry-eyed grass again, and a little cluster of flowers that are no bigger than your little finger. So it's hard to get the seed from the early season. It's harder to collect and deal with. When this flower is gone, it's like a grass. It is very hard to find. This is the last year's head of bush clover, another legume, and there are quite a few legumes in the prairie, and they're rather nutritious for animals like deer and rabbits and creatures that would like to feed on them. So you have to have enough to make it possible. In the background, you can see where we've removed leaves from trees and made it possible for the plants to express themselves. So there's where I've taken down a tree. In the long run, a chainsaw helps with the bigger branches. Loppers are a little more difficult to use. Again, looking at grass is starting to grow. I think in the mid-bottom is cordgrass, hardly discernible, but it's very typical of prairie. This is not weeds. It looks like weeds, but these are prairie plants, and they just don't jump out at you. Now this is probably about a week later. The starry-eyed grass is gone, but the same little blue stem is beginning to express itself as green right at the bottom. This is last year's big blue stem. It's almost like you put your hands around the bottom of the stem and let the stems fall. So it's like Skittles. So you can recognize the plant by the way it falls. This is very disturbing for if it's in a public place, because it doesn't look neat and tidy, but it's very natural for this plant. In the bottom right-hand corner is a daisy fleabane, and there's the start of a prairie purple cornflower, just in about the middle. And it has on the top of it last year's fruiting body, and it will be flowering soon. Now we're looking at the legume bush clover, and it's just beginning to grow out. Once again, it's having to make its way through the litter, the natural litter. This is a Tortoiscantia. It's blue. It flowers until noon, and it's a tough character. It can survive mowing and herbicide. It's interesting that its staminal hairs, if you look at them under a microscope, you can see the protoplasm streaming, so it's often used as a botanical laboratory specimen. In there, but again, it's smaller because it's on a gravel ballast it was. I think we have rosin weed, which belongs to a Silphium family, but it's beginning to see, you can see it's opposite leaves. It will flower with a yellow flower quite a way from now. Again, the daisy fleabane is there, and intermittently where it's been disturbed by somebody stomped on an area. Or most prairie is used to growing in fairly firm soil. The daisy fleabane grows on soft soil that's been disturbed. This is a compass plant. You see that its leaves used to be whole like dock, but they're invaginated now. That takes out the stomates that allow the moisture to be not lost. We're on a road, and this is an old Route 45. We would like to convert it to a bicycle trail, a prairie trail. In the distance, the slightly white area is a remnant prairie on a railroad bed. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, UPTV.